Hello and welcome back to Premier Injuries. This is the second part of our very special data show. Bit of hand movement there from Ben once again. He just can't help it. He's always, shape-shifting and everything. Now, before we get into the discussions, remember to like, share and subscribe to the channel because we've got some great content coming up. And, there's a lot of diverse stuff as well. We've got Dr. Raj kind of explaining about injuries. We've got our FPL stuff, but we've also got some high quality deep dive stuff like we're doing here today. And with this very special data show, if you missed the first part, we talked about some myths in the Premier League and maybe dispelling them. And that's what we're doing again here today, because we're looking at when teams have nothing to play for, and also the big word that scares a lot of people in football is rotation risk, especially towards the end of the season. And in the third show, so this is going to be a three-parter. Always, the best things in life come in trilogies, don't they, Ben? This is going to be a three-parter special with the third one going to help your FPL teams. Now, at the moment, today's discussion, the first one is when teams have nothing to play for. And so we set the benchmark here of this is when teams mathematically can't really change their position that much. Nothing really is going to come from it. So, for example, a team may be able to get from 15th to 9th, but they're not going to be able to get into the Europa League. This might be a team that is Champions League, but they won't be able to go above 4th or 3rd to maybe push for 2nd or 1st in the Premier League. They have realistically something to play for and slightly more prize money, but it's towards the end of the season. And this is reflected a little bit in the data as well, but I don't want to do any spoilers. The second bit is the rotation risk towards the end of the season. Now, a lot of people worry about rotation risk at all times of the season for all sorts of reasons. And Ben, you're always there to either kind of explain why it might be happening to the FPL community or to the football community as a whole, or you come in and say, don't worry, it's overplayed. So we're going to get onto that. But first of all, let's start off with discussion point 1, when teams have nothing to play for. To give insight, we looked at 4 seasons worth of Premier League data, starting with the anomalous, amazing 2019-20 season that was disrupted by COVID, and then going back to the 2016-17 season. We split this up into certain groups as well, because certain groups are affected by these anomalies more than others. So the title hunters are the teams fighting to win the Premier League late into the season, and at the end of the season they're the teams that come first or second. The European teams are those in and around the European slots, 4th to 7th. We're kind of looking at that, 3rd to 7th, looking at those teams there. Mid-table, teams unlikely to make it to that European spot that would grant them European football next season. And then the relegation battlers, those trying to fight and stay up. Now, these groups all have different needs, motivations, play styles, and thus that is why we split them into those groups as well, kind of in with teams that share the same mentalities, maybe not the same play styles, but definitely the same motivations. Some might have reasons to work harder and push through injuries, and some might just give up the ghost. Now, obviously, we looked at the Premier League as a whole. We looked at the 4 seasons and found that there's actually a huge difference in outputs in many data aspects when teams have nothing to play for. And hopefully this kind of helps more towards the end of the season, because there's a few teams that do have a lot to play for still. Each season, on average, teams will have about 2 games with nothing to play for. And I tell you what, that is when the fun really begins. There's a lot of goals, there's a lot of goals conceded. And so with these teams, they make exciting matches to look forward to, as there are, on average, across all these teams, 0.33 more goals per game scored and nearly half a goal more conceded. This is big stuff This is fantastic, and in terms of difference in output. Now, starting off with certain groups here. In fact, actually, before we look into the breakdown of groups, are you surprised at that, Ben? Or is this kind of aligning up with your assumptions of when teams have nothing to play for, they're really going to give good or bad performances?
Yeah, that would be my sort of thinking with that. Again, there's two schools of thought here. One is there's an acceptance. You know, there's you remove that pressure, and the dynamics of the situation change. So let's just go out and enjoy those final few weeks of the season. This may, for some players, it may be their one and only opportunity to play at the highest level, and then dropping down to the second tier football. So again, it's their chance to play in front of, well, I'm not going to say in front of some of the best supporters, but play at some of the best grounds in the world against some of the best players in the world to really sort of go out there and test themselves. And again, without maybe the pressures of needing that win, having to get that 3 points, just going out there and just enjoying things, and appreciating where you are. Yeah, and on the understanding, sometimes it will work in your favor and you may pull off a surprise result. But ultimately, if you're down there, you are down there for a reason. Um, it's not through any lack of endeavor or grit and passion. It's, sometimes, you're just not good enough. The Premier League in itself is particularly, it's well blessed with some of the world's best players because we pay some of the best wages and salaries within the world. So, there is no disgrace in being humiliated at this level because, like I say, there are teams and there are players in this league that can not only deliver domestically, they can do it on a European level, and they will do that, at the upcoming European Championships and the subsequent World Cup finals. They are that good on a world stage as well.
So let's look at those teams that are on the world stage, because this is the team that these are the teams that are the most unaffected, and quite frankly, you wouldn't be surprised at this because they do manage to find a little bit extra somehow. You didn't think it was possible, but these are the title hunting teams, and they are unaffected when they have nothing to play for. Indeed, actually, these teams seem to bang it up a notch. They have a higher point per game once the title is settled, these top two sides. And most excitingly, they actually go into a goal scoring frenzy because over the last 4 seasons, we've witnessed a near doubling of scoring output once these players are playing in low stakes games. They don't really have to worry about getting the title. Defending does get a little bit worse, also with nearly a quarter of a goal more conceded per game. But this does mean that towards the end of the season, hopefully we can see some really high scoring, free flowing football once the championship is decided from those first and second teams. And then moving it to the sides placed third to seventh, these teams also experienced a similar output to what we observed actually in our video, and I remind you just to go watch that one with the kind of game week 30 to 38 analysis that we did. So check that out because the points per game is slightly increased, but these teams seem to play with more conservatively in attack. They don't score that many more goals, but they also let in slightly more goals. So kind of comparing these two, Ben, does this shock you a little bit? Could this maybe be fatigue for those teams coming towards the end of the season, although all teams should be experiencing this? What is special about this third to seven group of teams that maybe is not reflected in the other data that we're looking at?
I mean, you touched upon one thing, and I'm going to stress, as I always do, it's never as simple as just being able to pinpoint one specific influence and factor. There are quite likely, numerous um, different pressures being applied to clubs, and why you may have these anomalies along the way. Uh, Inherently, if you're talking about a group that is in that third to seven, then they may already be involved in European competition first and foremost. So you touched upon fatigue being a thing, and we could be talking about teams who've already played, maybe if you include domestic fixtures as well, on the assumption that the better teams will progress deeper into those tournaments. We could already be looking at teams who have been playing maybe 7, 8, 9 more competitive games potentially than some of their other rivals within the league. So, that is a major influencing factor. And that's not just in terms of output and performance. Being able to play at optimum levels of performance game on game is difficult. Producing, not necessarily running the distance, but if you're a player that relies on quick thinking, quick turns of pace, that explosiveness, it's those number of high intensity runs that may come into effect there, and maybe affect a player's game. But it's also maybe the decision process when you become a little bit tired or a little bit fatigued, particularly towards maybe the latter part of a game, making the wrong decisions in the wrong areas, making that decision too slow, fundamentally can cost teams goals. So, that I think that's one of the things that's quite often overlooked, and when teams talk, well, particularly if we look at injuries, and you may be comparing a Manchester United or a Manchester City, although maybe that isn't a great example because they've got effectively 2 squads in one. But a Liverpool, if you're comparing it to somebody maybe who isn't involved in European competition, it isn't like for like, because these players have maybe played maybe 3, 4, 500 minutes more. They're playing 3 games every maybe 8 or 9 days. You've got the travel, those on European competition, Europa League on a Thursday night, they're traveling away, they're not getting back to the early hours of maybe Friday morning, sometimes a little bit later, they're playing again on Sunday. So there are a lot of factors to consider in that. And like I say, it's not just a case of being able to look, and it's not all black and white with that. So that doesn't come as any great surprise to me.
I just wanted to actually open up a bit of a point that you've said there. The 2 squads thing might actually be a fair comparison, because we focused on the last 4 seasons because there seems to be now super teams in the Premier League in terms of they're so far ahead. The points totals kind of indicate that they are heads and leagues above certain individuals. Manchester City and Liverpool seem to have done it. And then Chelsea in that 2016-17 season, where they set a points record until obviously Manchester City saw it and thought, we can smash that. So there's convergence, it seems, elsewhere in the league. But my question to you, Ben, is why does this when nothing to play for affect the top teams positively, but then this 3rd to 7th group negatively? Because you could say a lot of these problems that you've kind of explained there, with a lot of games, a lot of minutes played, is it because, as you've explained there, that basically Man City, Liverpool, and some of those really elite teams do have basically 2 squads that they can rotate and push on towards the end of the season with no real effects on fatigue?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, we singled out Manchester City, and we've seen in recent game weeks, Pep Roulette's been around for a long time, and it's quite an apt name. And we know that City, I think the last player they had signing was maybe Nathan Ake. We talked about a £50 million signing centre back, who is, what is he, arguably maybe 4th choice? Is he even 5th? Does he vie for a place with Eric Garcia? We're not sure, but he certainly is nowhere near Pep's first centre half pairing. We're talking about a squad of players, or players who aren't even getting in their match day squad. That's not fair. Who could walk into the majority of other, Premier League teams, they have this fluidity. He's able to, they have synergy within the squad. Let's not forget, I almost compared myself to when I played football a long, long time ago. Not to that level, I hasten to add. But the worst thing, if I was ever named as substitute on the bench, well, whether other players admit it or not, I was always there. I want the guy who's took my place to have a stinker. I dare say I want to get him injured. Maybe not seriously, but I want him off the pitch. With City, you don't really seem to have that. We've seen the likes of Raheem Sterling in recent times, not getting maybe the amount of first team minutes that we typically expect. Sergio Aguero, yeah, he's maybe come to the end of his City career, but he's back and he's fit, and he's still not even getting that start with. Gabriel Jesus, even, you've got two strikers there on the bench. And sometimes Pep is going with a false nine. He's either sticking Foden in there or Bernardo. You could put Mahrez in there. Even Kevin De Bruyne's had a bit of a spell. It's, so with City, they are the anomaly to everything. Teams are catching up. I think it's all about depth now within your squad, and not just having numbers. It's about having quality. And where in the past squads and managers would look and think, well, if I can have an international as a starter and a good solid backup, that's good enough. We're seeing now in some positions, you're having not one international start, you're having an international backup, and then you're having an international reserve to back up the backup. It's ridiculous. So, that's why it comes as no surprise to see off the back of, what we had last season and the quick turnaround, why maybe City have dealt with the demands of the Premier League this season better than any other side.
Let's move it on to the mid-table teams then, because we've really kind of teased out those two groups there. And just if you want to understand this data a little bit more, all this will be on the Premier Injuries website so that you can look on it, make what you want of it as well, and kind of analyse it yourself. It will be all on there with our articles and everything to help you out. So the mid-table teams placed 8th to 15th when they have nothing else to play for. These they're a little bit more like the table toppers once their season is wrapped off, because the handbrake is certainly let off with these teams. These sides maintain about the points per game, but with a slight 0.06 increase, so it's not too much. But what fascinates me with this is they're scoring a lot more and conceding a lot more. The average mid-table team side go from scoring 1.09 goals per game to 1.46 after they have nothing to play for. Plus, they let in 0.43 more goals per game too as well. So this group of teams, that 8th to 15th placing, there's going to be some exciting games there from historical data, and hopefully that translates to this season. They'll be scoring more. They'll also be conceding more. But the positive thing is you can hopefully maybe group up on the elite defences towards the top half of the table that will keep those clean sheets, and then you can move towards more of those teams that might be scoring. And this is where the differentials might come in. Now, also, the final group that we do have to talk about in terms of this before we analyse this a little bit more is the relegation fighting sides. And once again, we're not surprised here, are we, Ben, that there's a drop-off in points per game. This is the first group that actually do see that, but the fight goes from all areas. Interestingly, they don't give up too much on attacking, but they only score marginally more goals in those final matches, but they give up the ghost in defence. Defence, which has probably cost them throughout the whole of the season, goes on to a whole other level of tragedy when they see a massive drop-off, letting in 0.62 more goals per game. That's pretty huge stuff. So for the teams that will be playing these it's going to be a mouth-watering set of fixtures if you've got 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 of these teams to play in your final few games of the season, when you've got nothing to play for as well, and when they've got nothing to play for. And obviously with these groups as well, relegation teams the last few seasons, there's been quite a few of them that have had nothing to play for over 5 or 6 games, which again makes it enticing. Basically, the tactic is to kind of load up on assets that are playing them each week, and you're almost quids in. So maybe a final point here though, Ben, is do you think that these effects will be amplified more this season? We've seen the effects of COVID on squads, but also fatigue, injuries, all these seem to be up this season. And this kind of always seems to lead to more high scoring games, less focus on the football, and that ability to almost do the basics is thrown out the window as there's two sails to the wind. So maybe do you expect to see more goals to be scored in these fascinating nothing to play for games?
It's a good question. It's a difficult question. I think one of the maybe factors which could have a major impact on how this season plays out is the lack of a crowd, and maybe up until game week 36, and then hopefully by maybe week 37, 38, we've seen those teams who have that advantage of having home support in. They'll have that, there's going to be a buzz around the place. The fans are back, supporters are back. So, that's something to consider. In short, we don't know how this is going to pan out during this interim period because, again, we're still on unprecedented times. This is uncharted territory in terms of what we've come from, where we are, and where we need to go. Um, you know, I think teams undoubtedly have benefited from not having crowds at the game. Certain managers certainly have benefited from that. Um, I think when it's going bad, um, players maybe, there isn't the same maybe incentive, or there's certainly not that same level of scrutiny offered towards players where, um, they feel that the pressures of the environment to be able to perform it and push and push. So in that way, maybe those teams are just going to, and you wouldn't like to say that because we're talking about professionals at the highest level, but I'm just throwing it out there as a potential, as an opinion. Um, do players almost just accept that? Maybe the contracts are up. Maybe they know that if their club's getting relegated, they'll be leaving anyway. Maybe they're only at that club on loan. And once that final day goes, they're off and they're back to their parent club, and it doesn't really impact on them. I'm just saying that as a possible outlier. So without the crowd there on top, where's the pressure coming from apart from maybe intrinsically, where they have this, where they should be motivated to perform, after a long, hard season where the games have come thick and fast, it's condensed. Um, they may be looking at the wider circle. Maybe, like I say, there are other factors coming in where, they will be moving on, and players, therefore, I don't know, a player that springs to mind, and this is a John Lundstrom of this world. We know he's refused several tabled contract offers. We know that Sheffield United are going down. Does he play? Does he start for Sheffield United? What is the point of him actually starting for Sheffield United? He certainly isn't going to be in there in the long term. Do they need to start playing now towards that championship season and thinking, right, well, let's start putting the structure in place and the personnel in place to hopefully, ensure that we bounce straight back. So again, as we always say, and video after video, it's all about context, and it's about understang, and taking into consideration, all of these influencing factors, not just, whatever presents on face value.
And I think you've mentioned a point here that we want to talk about just to wrap up and summarize the end of the show, because a lot of people do worry about every manager almost becoming a Pep roulette themselves towards that end of season period. And you talked about it there. A lot of people will have an eye on the future, maybe with nothing to play for or not very much to play for. Their position, content, they're pretty safe. Maybe more youth players will get a few minutes. Maybe more people that have had long-term injuries just to get their fitness up before that pre-season period. There's all sorts of things at play. They might experiment a little bit, let the handbrake off. And as you said there, in terms of it, maybe playing towards their next season, whether that is in the Premier League or where they get relegated. So exploring some of this data, Ben, when teams are coming towards that end of season period, do we actually see a rise in rotation, or is this maybe something that is again overplayed in the narratives of the Premier League?
Yeah, so again, this was partly the reason that I like this topic to cover, just to maybe, because again, my own mindset is I'm looking at this running, and it's a it's a difficult minefield to try and navigate. Inherently, I would consider heavy rotation. Again, I'm thinking teams are managing injuries. Teams are already planning for next season. You have, business end of other competitions. So those involved in domestic, those involved in European. And so looking at, generalistically over each season, there is very little change in the actual number of changes made by teams on a game week by game week basis. It's in and around maybe 42, 43 to 44 changes across a full game week. So, if you base that on your 20 teams, we're looking at maybe 2.2 changes per team, typically week on week. However, the data does lend itself in support the claim that that we do see more rotation during this part of the campaign. Last season, again, was a little bit of an anomaly given the fact that we had up to game week 30 and then we had Project Restart. And that in itself allowed players that block period of time to almost recover, have a bit of a mini pre-season, and then see out this short block of games. So in terms of actual overall numbers, there were less changes. But we still did see this increase in the number of alterations made by managers from game week to game week. Now, what we've been keen to focus on is so ensure we've got consistency and like for like. We go from Premier League fixture to Premier League fixture because it's difficult to maybe interpret, how serious or, how a manager maybe want to consider domestic cup competition, regardless of, unless it's the final, maybe the semis and possibly even the quarters, we tend to see heavily rotated sides. Champions League is the same, in Europa League, particularly during those early rounds, you've got a little bit of a mixed bag there. So we go from Premier League to Premier League, and there isn't a great deal. But what I would say in comparing maybe the first sort of 30 games to this business end, we have seen an increase of almost 20% in the number of changes game on game, depending on, like I say, on these remaining games, which, if we're talking about from managers who would maybe make 2 changes to then potentially go into 3, 4, maybe 5, then it becomes a little bit more of a difficult to try and second guess managers, and therefore, the potential impact on our fantasy selections become a lot more great. What I would say is it's always about having a deep bench and having your strength in there. And you need to consider, if you're going for teams like Manchester City, we've seen in recent times. I think, like I say, we've had maybe game week 28 to 29, and then before that, we've seen Pep 7 changes, 6 changes, 7 changes, 5 changes. Last season alone, to give you an idea, I think Pep made in the region of 152, 53 changes over the course of the season. Second team in terms of rotation, and then that's your boys, that's Arsenal. And I think they came in at around about 102 to 103. So, that 50% increase on, more changes at City as opposed to the team in second place. And that purely just comes down to their strength and their depth of their squad. Yeah. So when we're looking to maybe pick those fantasy assets, consider again the squad. If you're maybe looking at, and we touched upon it, those teams in maybe 15, 16, 17, or 18s, they have the potential for the biggest upturn. Burnley would be a prime example to that. And you'd often see, Burnley with small squads, with limited numbers. That, Sean Dyche is going 4-4-2 first and foremost. And a lot of these players are touch and go every week, touch and go. But if it's a minor knock, if it's a minor niggle, he ain't going to be rotating them out because, he just doesn't have the strength and the depth in that squad to be able to do so. So, you're in a pretty good place to be able to look at some of those Burnley assets. If you want to look at the trends season on season and maybe pick players from a team where you've got a pretty good indication that they're going to start, it probably doesn't come as any great surprise. Wolves, for the last few years, they've had the lowest number of changes and rotations within that squad. This season we have seen a little bit of an increase in Nuno. Maybe he's changing things up again, but he does like a strong nucleus within that team, so looking at the likes of the Wolves and the Burnleys in this run-in, certainly if you want players to start, and get minutes on the belt, they're always good options to go down.
So maybe just to summarise, the final point here is, what is your advice then? Are you saying that people should be worried about rotation as we come towards the end of the season, or is it not any more pronounced than it is throughout the rest of a usual Premier League season?
It is pronounced. The data does say there will be an increase, but like everything, consider the bigger circle. Look at those teams who are still involved in European action. Look how that may impact on their league position. For example, we could be maybe looking at maybe an Arsenal who may feel that they're not able to go for those European places in the Premier League, but they want to push in the Europa. So therefore there's a shift in mindset from Mikel Arteta, where his focus now moves away from the Premier League to saying, right, well, I'm going into the Europa League, because if you win that, we can qualify for the Champions League. So, it's about understanding the wider circle. Will we see Tottenham now with no distractions, going out there full bore to hopefully secure European football? It'll be interesting to see Leicester City and how they, fulfill their remaining fixtures again without any distraction of European football. So you need to consider, I think you need to consider your moves just a little bit more. You need to be a little bit more strategic, and you need to understand that there are a lot of more a lot of things to consider at this stage of the season than inherently you would at any other point.
So that concludes our second part. So make sure that you stay subscribed to the channel, because we've got a third part coming up as well. And if you've not checked out part 1 as well, do check it out, because we go through some myth busting there as well. And remember, you can fully analyse all these trends that we've talked about in dedicated articles on the Premier Injuries website. So do like, share, and I want to ask you to comment as well if you enjoy this content so that we know that we're producing stuff that you like. It can even be that you've enjoyed it. Easy as that, just to let us know. And as I mentioned, subscribe for more of our leading data analysis, because we are Premier Injuries, the Premier League analysis company for injuries. But also in terms of it, we're not just focusing on hard data. We've got Dr. Raj, we've got FPL, and we do have Tactic Thursdays as well. There's a wide array of great footballing analysis and content. But many thanks to all of you for watching, and hopefully see you very soon. And just throwing it to Ben for any final words.
Thanks once again, Jason. Again, really enjoyed part 2, followed on from part 1. So if you have missed that, honestly, this guy has done an obscene amount of work in scraping all of the data, done a fantastic job. So fully deserves all the accolades that I'm sure you're going to be banging into that comment box, because this is, I know it's a true labor of love, Jason. So just to say, man, it's much appreciated. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what insights we can glean from part 3. But for now, that's the end of part 2 done.